Hello, and a great big welcome back to this next episode of Women's Business Voice. My name is Angela De Souza, I'm your host, and in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at how in the 1970s the women's liberation movement campaigned for women's rights. But as well as being political activists, many second wave feminists were entrepreneurs who also experimented with business practices. Dr. D.M. Withers introduces us to publishers and bookworkers of second wave feminism in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s to discuss how they navigated masculine systems of finance and equity in running their business. Dr. D.M. Withers is a lecturer in publishing at the University of Exeter. Their research focuses on the post-war publishing industries, especially feminist, queer, and women-led companies. They have published widely on the history of feminist publishers, Virago Press, including their book titled Virago Reprints and Modern Classics, The Timely Business of Feminist Publishing, which came out in 2021. DM is also a publisher and runs Lurid Editions, which publishes queer books from the 20th century archive. So there's no one better place to help guide us through the history of women and the publishing industry. So I'm going to hand over now to my fantastic co-host, Dr. Amy Edwards, and our very special guest, Dr. D.M. Withers. Over to you.
Thanks, Angela, for that. That was great. And what great introduction. So DM, I wondered, Angela's obviously touched on a bit of some of the different things that you've done and your background, but I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about kind of history you do and how you became interested in it.
Sure. So I'm a publishing historian of the post-war era with a particular focus on women, queer, migrants, and otherwise marginalised producers, individuals, and companies. And I became interested in this area through research on feminist social movements and culture within feminist social movements, and looking at the intersection between activists and business practices. And I began to drill down a bit more into book publishing when I was working on a project called The Business of Women's Words at the British Library. And in that role, and that was 2018, 2021, and in that role, I was responsible for cataloguing part of Carmen Khalil, the Virago founder, who we're going to go on to talk about in a bit more detail, her papers, and focusing on the history of Virago Press more broadly. And in that role, it gave me a lot of permission to really look into the business histories of these companies and thinking about them more in a business frame that I wasn't really able to do when I was doing research in a more kind of, I guess, an activist social movement context, because there's generally a bit of antipathy towards the idea of business and feminism within the women's liberation movement, or a kind of queasiness towards the idea of commercialism and those kinds of things. So I guess there was a bit of resistance to thinking about those histories in a more kind of situated within publishing history or business history. So that project gave me an opportunity to really do that research and think about those histories in a new frame, which I guess opens up different kinds of conversations and different kinds of ways of thinking about the position of women's role within the publishing industry and how feminism intersects within that. And I should also say that I am a publisher too. So I run a publishing company called Lurid Editions, who is responsible for, what we do is we curate conversations around the 20th century archive, publishing queer and feminist works that have fallen out of print. So this engagement with these histories also come with a practical dimension. I'm a business owner of sorts. I am a director of a company, but quite a very small one. But my engagement with these histories is kind of comes from those two places, I guess, from that kind of more archival research, sitting in an archive and trying to understand what was going on, and also from the kind of researching in the archive, looking for works that could be published, republished, and resituated in the present.
Yeah, that's really cool and quite a unique perspective, I think, because academics, not always, academics come from all sorts of different backgrounds, but often come at topics from mainly like a research interest. So it's really cool that you can kind of come from it also from the perspective of someone who is doing some of the stuff that you are then researching. People have done that in the past and things like that. So that's really a really interesting perspective, I guess. and also renders you perfect for talking to us today about our topic, which is the publishing industry. And you mentioned very briefly one publisher in particular who I know you know a lot about, which is Virago Press. So we'll definitely get onto them a bit later. But before we talk about Virago, I wondered if you could just help us out, fill us in as non-experts here, tell us a bit about the publishing industry, particularly in the late 20th century, but what kind of changes did the industry go through, and whether there was much space for women in that industry. Tell us all about it.
Sure. So there's three things to say here. I think the first thing is to say that up until, I think, around the 1980s or so, publishing was very much a gentleman's profession. That was the way in which it was described. So very, very male dominated, and also men from a particular class position as well, men of independent means. So publishing more as a hobby or indulgence, rather than necessarily like a hard business interest. So that's one thing to really kind of get your head around. And if women were working in publishing in the post-war period, it would often be in secretarial positions or in publicity. So Carmen Cleal started off as a publicity girl, as was called. And very few women occupied those positions of executive power. One of the exceptions of that is Laura Smallwood, who I think we'll talk about a bit at the end, she became managing director of Chatto and Windus in the mid-1970s, but she was on board of Chatto and Windus, being a kind of a smallish literary, not that small, but they were a literary firm. They were kind of a literary firm characteristic of the publishing organizations at the time, because publishing was also composed of lots more independent, smaller independent firms, particularly when compared with the publishing industry today, which is large conglomerate corporate structures which have bought up and swallowed up a lot of these smaller independent firms. Because in the post-war period, what you have is what's the period of conglomeration, or what has been described historically as conglomeration. So bigger media companies buying up these independent firms, which then become imprints of the kind of bigger corporate structure. So that's a process that's undergoing in the post-war period, and it kind of doesn't really fully take root in Britain until the late 1980s. But there are three things that are really important to get your head around: is the gentleman's profession, women's minor role within it, and the kind of different kinds of publishing structures that existed. And many of these independent firms were also trying to resist conglomeration for as long as possible. So they were devising strategies for collaboration and kind of establishing kind of smaller publishing groups. So like the Chatto, Jonathan Cape and Bodley Head, Chatto, Jonathan Cape and Bodley Head group, the CDC group, which Carmen Cleal joined. I know this is a bit complex, but just stay with me. They formed a partnership in the late 1960s with the intention of kind of being two independent and then three independently minded literary publishers who would then pool services and kind of resist the kind of mega conglomerates. But eventually they couldn't resist it, and they were bought up anyway. So there's these kind of dynamics in terms of how the publishing industry is changing, both in terms of gender and economics, and I guess as it becomes more capitalist, more business orientated.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And thank you so much for sketching out really clearly for us actually some of the big trends that are going on, so that when we get to the 1980s, the kind of gendering of it, but also some of the things that are going on in the publishing industry more broadly. So with that wider picture in mind, could you tell us about Virago Press, which was one of the most commercially successful feminist publishers, I think, of the late 20th century? I'm saying this as if I know. This is because I checked in with you beforehand.
Sure.
Could you tell us about Virago and how they sit in this wider industry?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is print culture within the feminist movement that already started off in the late 60s, early 1970s, was really, really important. So when I say print culture, I mean all different kinds of printed matter, from newsletters, pamphlets, and then later books that are produced. So the written word has a really, really important role in feminism, in that period, both as a kind of distributor of ideas, but also as a formation of community, as it did in earlier eras of feminism, and probably has done since, even in a digital way. So there was a huge production of written matter in the women's movement, lots of new ideas coming out. And really the idea for starting a feminist publisher that was Carmen's idea initially came about through her meeting of Marsha Rowe, who was involved in the underground press at the time, and then subsequently went on to set up Spare Rib. And so the idea initially was Spare Rib Books. So Virago was for a very short period of time was called Spare Rib Books. So it was like a kind of it was to be, because Spare Rib, the ambition for Spare Rib was to take these feminist ideas out of the underground and onto the newsstands. So the idea for Virago, as it became, was that had a similar kind of aim, but with books. So and the idea from the start was always to be a mass market publisher as well. It was never satisfied. Carmen was never satisfied with just being connected with the women's liberation movement, even though that's a perfectly fine thing to be. There was always the aim to not just publish for yourself, but also publish for everyone. So being a kind of mass market publisher was part of the aim to start with. And when Virago set up in 1973, they actually existed as an editorial imprint of Quartet Books that was run by William Booth and James Miller, who were Carmen Collier's boss at Panther in the late 1960s. And what that enabled them to do was they kind of developed the list and developed their ideas editorially, but they didn't have full control over the operation. So they spent that same period kind of raising the finance to become an independent company. And the other thing that's important in that period in terms of how they grew as well is the role of reprints. So one of the problems with developing a commercially successful publisher is having enough things to publish. So when you're relying on new works and commissioning new works of written matter, whether it's non-fiction or fiction, it takes time for people to deliver those works. So one of the kind of big changes when Virago became independent in 1976 is that they started to print reprints, so books that were already written and had already been produced but had fallen out of print. So that gave them a whole set of titles that they could then pick up and acquire rights for and then sell to this audience of people who are interested in feminism. Initially, that was non-fiction works, so actually works of early history, early feminist social science, biographies, so books about the suffrage movement, and things like that. But one of the big changes came when Carmen came up with the idea for the Virago Modern Classics, which is the kind of thing that I guess defines her career at Virago, and also is probably one of the most significant legacies of her whole publishing. And what's different about that is that it's the Virago Modern Classics were fictional works, so had the kind of dual action of providing her with lots of different books that she could republish, but it also enabled Virago to connect with different kinds of audiences as well. So, and that period when they started doing the Virago Modern Classics is when and not only the Virago Modern Classics, they also republished Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, which was her memoir of the First World War. And at the same time, in the late 1970s, there was also a BBC drama, like an adaptation of Testament of Youth. And that was huge for Virago in terms of just boosting their sales. So moving them out of being a fairly niche publisher that was kind of connected to a kind of smaller audience that was connected to the women's liberation movement, to getting into people's homes, getting into people's living rooms, and engaging with a completely different kind of audience, and therefore breaking down lots of social attitudes as well. Because I think one thing that's quite hard to remember from the vantage point of today is just how terrifying a lot of feminist ideas were, both in terms of just and how confrontational that they were, and the kind of the fear of feminism. So they were breaking down those ideas as well, and I think that's an important thing to remember and grasp. So yeah, that was the kind of key aspect of how they developed and grew in the 1970s. So in 1976 to 1982, they were small entrepreneurial firm. And through that activity, Carmen got recognised by the CEC group, who I mentioned before, the chairman of that, as a successor for Laura Smallwood. And she was effectively headhunted to become the new managing director of Chatfield Windus. And Virago went with them, went with her as part of the deal. So, because it was seen as an attractive acquisition at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. So we have, by the sounds of it, we have this kind of initially maybe small, but then increasingly commercially successful feminist publisher. And you've mentioned a couple of times Carmen Khalil, who is the person who is kind of overseeing some of this, who is kind of promoting it, and as you say, kind of has some of the key ideas that help Virago transform into that kind of slightly more mainstream publisher. Could you tell us just a bit more about her, who she was, what her experiences of being a woman in this industry were?
Yeah, sure. So Carmen actually arrived in Britain in the early 1960s. So she's Australian. That's the kind of one thing to say. And she arrived in Britain in the 1960s and did various different jobs in the publishing industry at that time. And by the time that Virago had become quite successful in the late 1970s, she's beginning to get, I guess, more recognition. And I think she's seen as a bit of a curiosity as well. So there's a really interesting interview that was done on Granada television where she appears in the late 1970s. And Mavis Nicholson is interviewing her and she's asking her, like, well, how do you cope in terms of, your home life, your domestic life? She was never married. She lived with cats and dogs her whole life. She loved cats and dogs, and they always had really interesting names. And they were asking her, how do you cope with work? Because usually there's, behind every successful man, there's a successful woman. So how do you cope? She just answered it and said, well, I don't make the bed in the morning, and I go out and I do the laundrette on Saturday, and I don't do any housework. My house is really messy. So, but there was a real kind of pressing, like a real kind of grappling with that question of, well, how do you do this? So you're doing two jobs at the same time. So I think that's useful for kind of really kind of understanding the barriers that they were breaking down at the time in through working and starting their own businesses, and really challenging in an absolutely fundamental way ideas of what women do in the workplace, because they were very unusual. She was really unusual coming into the publishing industry and starting up this company, and with Ursula Owen and Harriet Spicer as well. They ran Virago in the 1970s, the three of them, but she was the managing director. So there's a kind of, she was sort of seen as a curiosity. I guess one thing would say about Carmen, she did get a lot of bad press for her managerial style, and I think it's worth noting that as well. She was seen as quite a forthright communicator, very direct. I wouldn't say tyrannical, but like lots of stories, anecdotal stories about people crying in the toilets. And then she would say also, well, I was crying too in a different toilet. But she was quite fierce, I think, in a managerial sense. And Lenny Goodings, in her memoir, A Bite of the Apple, she talked about how her managerial style just wouldn't cut it in today's world. But nonetheless, she was incredibly hardworking, and I think the fact that she was working in an entrepreneurial capacity in the 1970s in that small, agile entrepreneurial firm quite well suited her, because she was incredibly hardworking. People talk about her being almost obsessive, just absolutely relentless in terms of her approach to the work, and when she. They had to work so hard. I mean, that's the thing, as entrepreneurs, as people running businesses, to really make a success of something, you have, and probably anything, but you have to be so driven and you have to work so hard. And they did, she was an incredibly hard-working person. And the other thing to say, which I think is really interesting in terms of the history of publishing and kind of women entering into that workforce, is that she worked in publicity in the 1960s, so she had a really big address book. So when she left Panther in the late 1960s and decided to go freelance, but she wanted to kind of concentrate on a more self-directed, this is before Virago, a self-directed publishing venture. But she took with her a very big a dress book, and she had the ear and she had the advice of very, very influential men in the publishing industry. So most notably people like Paul Hamlin. So she actually met Paul Hamlin in the early 1960s. And in fact, one of her first jobs in the book trade was working for Paul Hamlin. So Paul Hamlin is probably one of the most influential and important publishers that you don't hear about in post-war British history, because he's quite a sort of, I would say, shady figure, but he's not your Alan Lane. He's not, he wasn't working in a kind of literary publishing. He was publishing that more kind of populist publishing. The Hamlin Colour Cookbook is probably the book that you'll be familiar with. So popularising kind of more, popular books, basically. But enormously successful, enormously profitable, and an enormously clever businessman. So before he becomes famous, so to speak, Carmen works for him selling books on Park Lane out on the street in the early 1960s. So, and they begin a very affectionate and supportive relationship and friendship that lasts their whole lives. And what's significant about Hamlin is the social capital, the kind of the knowledge that is needed to be successful in the publishing industry, and working with banks in particular, and the kind of things you need to say with banks and negotiating with banks. He passed that knowledge on to Carmen, and she was always asking questions and never afraid to get that information. If she didn't know something, she would ask questions to get the information she needed to move on and achieve the goal. As I say, her address book comprised of a lot of influential people, and also, as I say, with Hamlin and also Robert Gavron, the printing entrepreneur, both of whom became quite, financed New Labour in the 1990s. She also had the financial backing as well of them. So they guaranteed part of the bank loan that when Braga became independent in the 1970s. So and Gavron was involved in various different ways in the kind of financial life of the company as the decades wore on, so the 80s into the 90s. So that's something, I think that's something that's really important, is that kind of, I say, appropriation of knowledge, of power, of male knowledge, knowledge that was ensconced within the gentlemen's clubs, the closed rooms. She was able to unlock those and really put them into a context that was, kind of the low-hanging fruit of a mass market feminist publishing company. And the other thing, finally, to say about her, which is different to previous generations, is because she was a publicist first, she brought that skill and that knowledge of publicity with that kind of executive power to publish. And that was very much part of the changing trends of publishing in the late 20th century, is that kind of turn towards, I guess, the author as a celebrity, the author as self-publicist. So that kind of influence in terms of the cultural shift within the publishing industry is also, I would say, it's completely responsible. She's not completely responsible for it. There's certainly other people like Liz Calder as well, but she was driving that kind of change.
She sounds like a really fascinating woman, and like a really interesting example of someone forging a career in an industry that perhaps wasn't immediately welcome to women. But I appreciate we don't have loads and loads of time, but there was someone else I did wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about, which is, I guess, almost Carmen Khalil's predecessor, who was Nora Smallwood, but who perhaps, if Carmen became a bit of a figure and known for being this woman who kind of made waves, Nora seems to have been a bit more overlooked. Could you just tell us a tiny bit about her?
Yeah, so as I say, Carmen Khalil succeeded Nora Smallwood at Chatham, headhunted in the mid of 1981. They were first thinking about it, and then she finally took over, I think, in February 1982. So Nora Smallwood, I think she has been eclipsed in the history of publishing, mainly because I think that at the time, she was seen as being, Nora Smallwood was, the way people talk about her as formidable, indomitable, all these kinds of quite sexist ways of talking about powerful women with power in the industry. And I think when Carmen Khalil came into the role, she was more indomitable than Nora Smallwood. So she kind of blotted Nora out. And what we're left with is these, if we're left at all with any kind of memory or narrative around Nora Smallwood's legacy, it's these very kind of brief kind of references to either her indomitability, her formidableness, or the fact that she was not very good as a publisher and as a business woman. And that's something that also kind of appears in the kind of scant critical commentary on Nora Smallwood's legacy and Chatto and Windus, because Chatto and Windus in the 1970s, when she was in control of them, they were faltering, or they weren't particularly profitable. I would argue that's not her fault. That's because of the wider kind of industry context. However, there is a really good story at the end of Smallwood's career. So she died in 1984. It's in, I think she was about 74. And right at the end of her career, just as she's handing over the reins of the role, so she'd be in her early 70s. And that's the other reason they wanted to get rid of her, is because they thought she would never retire. She manages to negotiate a really big deal for the Wolfe estate. So she was a brilliant negotiator for her on behalf of her authors, for getting better contracts for the works that they created. And one of the estates that she looked after was the Wolfe estate, because Chatto and Windus bought the Hogarth Press, so Virginia Woolf's estate. So she, very much towards the end of her life, she negotiates this deal, a better deal, playing off Peter Mayer, who was the Penguin CEO at the time. He was one of the most powerful men in publishing, and he made a deal for the Wolfe estate, and she basically refused it because it wasn't good enough, and she pushed back against him, trying to reduce the royalty rates, and eventually got a better deal with another publisher for this estate, and ensuring that Chatto and Windus had, a good amount of money coming in for this, the kind of crown jewels, really. We're talking the Virginia Woolf estate of the company. And that's just not the picture we have of Nora Smallwood at all, of somebody who was ruthlessly, or clever, not ruthlessly, but just with all of her experience and knowledge, really cleverly negotiating rights deals and asserting herself confidently and intelligently, and just refusing to be pushed around by these upstart men. And maybe in the context of the time, that was part of the reason she got this reputation. But I think it's really important to honour her knowledge as a publisher and her experience, and also just to put it on record that she was actually a brilliant developer of the authors and their careers and their livelihoods, and that has significance for the value that's generated within the publishing industry today, because many of these authors that she developed, so Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Taylor, A.S. Byatt, A.S. Byatt went on to win the Booker Prize when Carmen Khalil was publishing her at Chatto and Windus. Many of these authors continue to return value for the publishers today, and that was part of her development of their literary voices. So I think it's important to recognise both that kind of editorial care and that editorial skill, and also the kind of ability to just do a really good deal. And she was also very interested in book jackets and kind of publicity and that kind of design production space. So I think it's worth, and she was very good at that. So I think it's worth mentioning that too.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you so much for sharing the lives of these two women. I suppose that certainly someone like myself wouldn't necessarily have heard of otherwise. I'm aware that we'll be coming towards the end of our episode, so I might wrap two questions into one, and you can kind of take what you want from them. So it seems like there was slowly more and more space for women in the publishing industry, sort of over the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I guess that then leads us slightly up to today. And thinking about, so where does that leave us in terms of gender and the publishing industry and women's working lives in this period?
Yeah, I think in the late 20th century, so the 80s and 90s, you see a massive shift in the demographic of the publishing industry. And part of that came from activism and advocacy. So there was a group called Women in Publishing who did a lot of training and advocacy and professional development work for women involved in publishing. And that training, I think, helped build confidence and expertise and solidarity among women in the industry that perhaps didn't exist before. So that's that. And there's a oral history project called Women in Publishing. They've got a website, so there's some nice snippets of people who are talking about their working lives and that kind of thing. But you see, by the end of Carmen Khalil's career, she leaves Random House as it was, because Chatham Winters gets bought by Random House in 1987, so it becomes part of this conglomerate structure. She's effectively lapped by people like Gail Rebuck, who becomes CEO of Random House UK in 1991. I don't think Carmen had any problem with that, so I don't think she was necessarily trying to break open the glass ceiling and reach the very top. I think she just wanted to do something which she wanted to do. She wasn't necessarily like career focused. She was more about interested in the kind of creativity and developing projects and enabling things to grow. But what you see is more women gaining that kind of executive power within the publishing industry in the 90s and into the 2000s, where you get to the position today where one of the debates in the publishing industry is, are men being pushed out of publishing? So you see in 2025, so this year, Conduit Books, which is founded by Jude Cook, which is a publisher that aims to publish male voices specifically. That generated quite a lot of column inches and debate and discussion, and continues to. And it's worth saying that, to a certain extent, the kind of claim that the publishing industry is like women dominated kind of bears fruit when you look at the statistics. Okay, so like 2 out of 5 CEOs of large corporations are women. So there is a slight gender imbalance there. But in the UK publishing industry, women are highly represented in editorial roles. So 78% of editors identify as female in 2021. So that has significance in terms of, shaping the kinds of books that are published and how they are commissioned, kind of stories that they're saying. In the Publishing Association 2024 Workforce Reports, the people who responded to that survey, female representation remained high. So just over 2 in 3 respondents, 68%, identified as female in the industry. So there's a huge shift in terms of the higher powers, the kind of executive power, and also just in terms of the broad base of who's working in the industry. Whether or not that has an impact on things like literary awards is questionable. So the Booker Prize, which is the main prestigious literary prize, it was the last 10 years, 7 of the winners were male, 4 were women. Last 11 years, isn't it? So there's still kind of imbalance there. But I would say, like, broadly speaking, yeah, there's a lot of women who work in publishing, and a lot of them hold various degrees of executive or decision-making power. And yeah, I mean, whether or not it means that men are being pushed out of publishing is another thing entirely. But you can definitely see like an absolute transformation of the workforce. And certainly, I teach publishing at the University of Exeter, and often we only have 1 or 2 male identified people who take the course with a cohort of, say, like 23, 24 consistently. And there's a huge imbalance there. So so I think it's an interesting story of I guess a success story in a way, but definitely from the shift from the gentleman's profession to a much more female dominated workforce is the story of publishing in the 20th and into the 21st century.
That feels like the absolute perfect way to end the episode. Thank you so much, DM. That was really interesting. Thank you for sharing with us some of the stories of the people involved in the publishing industry and the changing position of women in that industry and what that has looked like, and particularly through the lens of those 2 women, Carmen Khalil, Nora Smallwood, and kind of the reputations they had and how they forged new ways of being. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, that I guess pretty much wraps up another episode for us. So job done. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice. where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.